The Second World War ended in fire and fury, but its origins lie in a war of ideas.
Liberal democracy had to face its greatest challengers, fascism and communism, and meet them head-on. While fascism lies defeated, communism is stronger than ever, ready for the next fight.
But what some call a liberal victory comes with a bitter aftertaste. Traumatic experiences change people, and the same is broadly true for war and the society's predominant ideology. Questions like why liberal democracy failed so spectacularly in Germany weigh heavy on the minds of liberal thinkers.
Of course, in 1946, many smart people in and outside the ivory towers are already busy contemplating answers to these questions. But before we can get to that, we need to understand where liberalism comes from and what it promises. I am Anna Deinhard and welcome to Season 1 of TimeGhost Cold War coverage in our series War to War, where we follow the wars that wouldn't end within a Cold World War, the beginning of the digital age, the atomic age, and the space age, when we began to replicate our minds electronically, gained the power to end our very existence as a species, and discovered that we can truly reach for the stars.
And I am Sebastian Brandstetter. Let's get started. To begin, we briefly need to go back to 13th century Paris, its university, and one of its most prominent wise men, Thomas Aquinas.
He thinks that God created the universe according to a grand plan, with us as rational and free individuals in it.
Using our God-given faculty of reason, Aquinas says we can glimpse part of the divine plan and act in accordance with it. Put simply, if we observe and think, the truth will reveal itself. It's almost as if Aquinas is saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident, but more on that later.
Okay, let's jump forward in time. We're still in Paris, but it's the year of the Lord, 1651, and Thomas Hobbes has just published his magnum opus, Leviathan.
In Britain, civil war rages between monarchists and parliamentarians.
This is part of a broader intellectual movement. The God-given order of things, including absolutist monarchs by God's grace, is being questioned.
This leads to a problem, though. If we do not base society on God's plan, then, well, what do we base it on instead?
Hobbes has a, and perhaps the answer, social contract theory. Hobbes asks a radical question. What would the world look like without government?
Imagine people living together without rules. What stops the strong from robbing, subjugating, or killing? Here, only survival matters, says Hobbes.
This is the state of nature, and he describes it as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He explains that at this point, people create a social contract. By doing so, they agree to give up certain freedoms. For instance, the freedom to kill or pillage in exchange for other freedoms, namely security against being killed or pillaged. Essentially, the contract trades a freedom to do harm for freedom from harm.
And the job of government is to enforce the social contract, what Hobbes calls the Leviathan, a towering, all-powerful beast looming over society, ready to strike down anyone who dares break the pact. Essentially, Hobbes takes the concept of a sovereign and detaches it from religion, basing it on something that resembles mutual benefit.
Hobbes' work inspires another Englishman, John Locke. He takes Hobbes' social contract theory, and what he comes up with earns him the moniker of father of liberalism.
Very crudely put, he mixes Aquinas' natural law and Hobbes' social contract. To Locke, there are three fundamental rights that exist before any government, making them pre-political: life, liberty, and property.
Contrary to Hobbes, Locke argues that government exists to protect natural rights, not just maintain order, and must not violate these fundamental freedoms.
If it does, that's tyranny. giving people the right to rebel. Crucially, this means government is based on consent to a degree. Just 72 years after John Locke's death, his ideas are first used in practice. It's not hard to see where the US Declaration of Independence takes inspiration from when it states,
"We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." But there is a problem. All men are created equal is not strictly true. For the moment, it's only white men who pay taxes that are equal, not black men or Native Americans or women. This is hypocrisy, says Mary Wollstonecraft.
In 1792, she published A Vindication of the Rights of Women and makes her case.
She argues that men and women live in the same world created by the same God. Using liberal logic, she argues that they fall under the same moral or natural law. Hence, women also enjoy these inalienable rights.
Though Wollstonecraft's ideas don't transform society overnight, they plant seeds for the 19th century liberal expansions and for later feminist movements. By the mid-19th century, liberal thought takes on an even more concrete shape with figures like John Stuart Mill.
Liberalism undergoes two big expansions. Who enjoys these rights, like women, following Wollstonecraft's logic, and which rights are protected?
Mill adds free speech to liberalism's growing list of essential rights. In On Liberty, he explains why open debate matters.
Mill argues that open debate tests ideas, exposing errors and transforming dogmas into justified beliefs in a marketplace of ideas. Once a concept survives scrutiny from all sides, it is more likely to be true.
And in this context, democracy emerges as a natural partner. If reasoned debate leads to better governance, why not let everyone have a say?
Mill argues that democracy, more than any other form of government, encourages people to educate themselves, resulting in better scrutiny of ideas.
Moreover, Mill believes a truly liberal society, where liberty and freedom of expression are protected, presents the best check against tyranny. In the same spirit, many liberals of the era believed that education, industrial growth, and free debate would usher in a period of peace and progress. There is no need to settle dispute with violence. After all, we have the faculty of reason and can debate instead.
Though, as we'd learned in 1914, that optimism is partly misplaced.
So far, we've talked about classical liberalism. But by the late 19th century, growing awareness of inequality and the consequences of rapid industrialization and unregulated markets force a rethink. But the ultimate catalyst for change is the First World War and its impact on the global economy.
But first, what do classical liberals actually believe? Small government, free markets, and a hands-off, laissez-faire approach.
And there's a reason for that. As we've seen, liberalism grows out of a reaction to capricious absolutism. To early liberals, the greatest threat to liberty is a government that does too much.
Classical liberals believe that if individuals are free to work, trade, and compete, society will regulate itself. Too much government risks becoming the very tyranny Locke warns about. But as democracy spreads, economic growth doesn't guarantee freedom for all.
And World War I accelerates that evolution. The war topples 3 of Europe's great autocratic empires: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. At the same time, countries like New Zealand, Finland, and Sweden, which had already been moving toward democracy, further consolidate liberal governance. For the moment, liberalism seems triumphant.
But the war also fuels instability, economic ruin, and disillusionment. The promises of self-determination remain unfulfilled for many, and rising nationalist and socialist movements challenge liberal democracy from opposite directions. The war may have removed old monarchs, but it leaves societies battered. Former soldiers return to unemployment, economic struggle to adjust, and governments facing mass unrest expand their role in ways that just recently seemed unthinkable.
And then comes the Great Depression in 1929, and it shatters faith in the idea that free markets can regulate themselves at all. Liberty means little if you're crammed into a tiny room with 20 people working 15-hour shifts, coughing up blood because you have tuberculosis and you're starving at the same time. Economic realities can render freedom meaningless, a point new liberals make as they push for social protections or more government.
In short, economic realities push even the most committed liberals towards new ideas, one that call for more government intervention, not less. This is how classical liberalism transforms into social or new liberalism. Governments begin enacting protections for workers, regulating markets, and creating social safety nets. But not everyone welcomes the shift.
Across Europe, liberal democracy finds itself under attack from fascists who see it as weak, from communists who see it as corrupt, and from those who simply long for the return to the old order of things.
The 1930s become a battleground of ideologies. The reaction to liberalism will be just as transformative as liberalism itself.
The fall of Weimar Germany to authoritarianism and its slip into what can only be described as depravity and the World War it unleashes is something liberals need to address. And some already are.
Last year, in 1945, Karl Popper published his book The Open Society and Its Enemies. In it, he addresses some of the reasons that enabled the Nazi catastrophe to begin in a liberal system. Popper believes that free speech and absolute tolerance of opinions are noble and worthwhile liberties.
But they do have limits. In a completely tolerant society, where freedom of expression is taken to the extreme, an interesting paradox arises. If said society is tolerant of the intolerant, and the Nazis can serve as a great example here, it is possible that the intolerant will come into power.
Once in power, the intolerant reject tolerance itself. To safeguard democracy, Popper argues for absolute intolerance of intolerance.
Popper further believes that many thinkers ask the wrong question. It's not who should rule, but it's how do we ensure a peaceful transfer of power?
Because that's where authoritarian systems past and present turn violent and arise. Take a king's death. The question of succession is often settled with bloodshed.
Popper argues that liberal democracy solves this problem best. And last, there's also this. Popper admits that democracy is not perfect, and that that's a strength, not a weakness. Unlike other visions of government, it does not purport to be the end-all, be-all, and admits it can make mistakes.
Its advantage lies in precisely this. Trying to fix clear problems instead of reaching for utopian ideals, making mistakes, learning from said mistakes, and trying again. It is no coincidence that this seems similar to the scientific method after all. Popper already revolutionized that field too.
His key contribution here was the principle, or is the principle, of falsifiability. The idea that for a theory to be scientific, it must be testable and capable of being proven wrong. Just as science advances by discarding flawed hypotheses, liberal democracy refines itself by recognizing failures and adapting.
But Popper is not the only one developing new ideas.
No, he is not. Questions are being raised as to why liberal rights do not apply to the colonial subjects. Given the newly established UN Charter, which outlines fundamental human rights and the right to nations to self-determination, along with President Roosevelt's promises, liberal rights may soon extend beyond the West.
And things are already going in that direction. In the newly formed United Nations, which is supposed to succeed whether its predecessor, the League of Nations, failed. Just this year, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights was formed.
And it is supposed to set rights we have by virtue of simply being human, incorporating much of the existing liberal rights but expanding them further. It will likely take a couple of years before we will see any definite progress. But will nations truly stand behind it? Some may see these rights as universal, but others as a challenge to sovereignty. In the end, will human rights become a reality, or will they remain an unfulfilled promise?
Once again, liberalism is expanding in the same two ways we saw before. The scope of liberal rights in both who they apply to and how many there are. However, there are still critics, like Hannah Arendt.
This year, she published an essay titled The Rights of Man. What are they? That's the title, which highlights a contradiction within the human rights framework.
As we have seen, human rights or natural rights are often described as universal and unalienable, granted simply by virtue of being human. But not everyone agrees, and as we'll see, thinkers like Arendt raise important challenges to these ideas.
Arendt says that all the things we talked about assume that the individual exists outside any higher authority, whether it be religious, social, or political, doesn't really matter. Arendt argues that rights only have meaning when a political community recognizes and enforces them.
And this is where, according to Arendt, the problems begin. Because human rights will be declared by the UN.
Which is an assembly of states.
Yeah, true. Their enforcement ultimately depends on national governments.
And in practice, this means that a lot of people who are not members of a state, while they still might in theory possess these rights, have no one to enforce them. In effect, if you are stateless, you are rightless.
To summarize, if human rights only apply when a state enforces them, then they aren't truly universal. As soon as someone loses their political membership or never had one to begin with, they also effectively lose access to their so-called inalienable rights.
Yet, Arendt doesn't just highlight the problem, she also provides a solution. Before any other rights can be guaranteed, there must be a first fundamental right. The right to have rights.
This means that everyone must have the inherent right to political membership somewhere, because only then can human rights actually exist in practice and according to their definition.
Whether the UN takes Arendt's objection seriously remains to be seen, but we'll be watching.
Liberalism has always evolved, expanding who gets rights, what rights exist, and how they're enforced. But as Hannah Arendt shows, none of it matters if those rights don't exist in practice.
And the challenge of ensuring this right to have rights is more relevant than ever. Colonial empires, apartheid, and the rights of women. All these are problems that liberal democracies need to address.
All the while, communism, a new opponent, has gained a firm grip around the world, and only time will tell which of the two predominant systems of thought prevails. One thing is certain: their competition will have grave consequences in the world of ideas and the real world.
Already, tensions are rising, rival blocs are forming, and both sides see the other as an existential threat. This isn't just a battle of philosophy, it's a struggle that will shape economies, governments, and even possibly military conflicts. The world is on the brink of a new kind of war, one fought in shadows, proxy battles, and ideological campaigns.
And just like ideas shape history, so do the people who explore them. If you want to be part of exploring more history like this, join us at timeghost.tv or patreon.com and be part of the TimeGhost army.
Excelsior!